The first time Darrow came to the window, she pressed her face against the scratched polycarbonate and fogged it with 6 nostrils. Marcus Webb had been sliding a tray of reconstituted protein loaf into the warming drawer when he noticed her. He didn't startle. 17 years on Waystation Teller 9 had given him a solid grip on his nerves, and besides, he'd seen stranger things pressed against his kitchen window than a child's face. He turned back to the protein loaf, adjusted the drawer temperature, and let her stare. She was maybe 4 feet tall, which meant nothing because Webb had long since stopped translating alien body ratios into human equivalents. Her skin had the color and texture of old birchbark, pale, slightly ridged, dappled with darker patches that caught the light differently depending on her angle. Her eyes were enormous, amber, compound like an insect's but visibly structured in a way that suggested she saw in spectrums Webb couldn't name. She had 2 arms that ended in 4-fingered hands pressed flat against the polycarbonate, and 6 small nasal slits arranged in 2 rows above a wide, thin-lipped mouth. She looked hungry. Not the kind of hungry that came from missing a meal. The deep kind. The patient, experienced kind that knows better than to hope too loudly. Webb put a second portion of protein loaf in the warming drawer. He didn't know then what she was. He didn't know that the wreckage of the Veth cellar was still tumbling in a slow decay orbit 300 kilometers above the station. He didn't know that the solar event that had destroyed it, a coronal mass ejection of a scale Teller 9's instruments had never before recorded, a stellar expulsion so violent that it had reduced the ship's hull to vapor in under 4 seconds, had killed 92 adult crew members, and left 11 children floating in an emergency life pod for 6 days before the station's long-range proximity sensors caught the pod's beacon. He didn't know that the survivors had been brought aboard 36 hours ago, quietly, while he was sleeping, and that the station's director of operations had decided to house them in the transit annex 2 corridors from the mess hall while she figured out what to do with them. He knew none of that. He just slid the protein loaf out of the drawer when it was warm, cut it into pieces sized for smaller hands than his, put it on a plate, and walked to the service door. When he opened it, she was already there. She looked up at him. He looked down at her. He held out the plate. She took a piece, sniffed it with all 6 nostrils at once, and then put it in her mouth. She chewed for a long time. Then she looked up at him again with those amber compound eyes, and Webb had the distinct impression that, whatever she was thinking, it was complicated. "More," he said. She didn't understand the word, but she understood the gesture when he tilted the plate. She took another piece. That was the first day. By the 3rd day, there were 4 of them. Webb had started waking up an hour early to have extra portions ready. He'd told nobody. Director Osai would have had opinions about it, and Webb had neither the patience nor the energy for Director Osai's opinions. Os ran the administrative side of Teller 9 with the particular brand of anxious authority that came from someone who had risen to their position through paperwork rather than competence and secretly knew it. She was perpetually worried about protocol. Webb was perpetually worried about lunch. The 4 kids had started congregating outside the service door before he even turned the warming drawers on. He could hear them out there, a low, clicking vocalization that wasn't quite language, or at least not language he had any framework for. It rose and fell in patterns that began to feel familiar after a few days. Not words, rhythms. The way kids sound when they're waiting for something they want but are trying to be patient about it. He learned their faces fast. Darrow, the first one, who was clearly the eldest, and moved with the careful deliberateness of someone who'd been in charge of something recently, and hadn't entirely adjusted to not being. There was a seriousness to her that went beyond age. She was the one who made sure the younger ones ate before she did, who always positioned herself so her back was to the wall when they were outside, who sometimes stared at nothing for long stretches in a way that Webb recognized as the particular vacancy of someone replaying something they couldn't change. Fen, who had a long scar across one arm and ate twice as fast as the others and watched the door when they ate, watching for threats. She had the unsettling attentiveness of someone who'd been responsible for watching things in the past and had learned, the hard way, that the moment you stopped watching was the moment something came through. She ate fast because she needed her hands free. Kale, who was smaller than the other three and ate methodically, piece by piece, in a precise order that Webb came to recognize and tried to replicate in how he arranged the plate. He didn't look at anyone while he ate. He looked at the food. He counted something under his breath, or what passed for breath, in a rhythm Webb eventually figured out was the eating order itself, a ritual he'd apparently worked out in the life pod, and was now maintaining with the grim discipline of someone who needed his rituals very badly and was not about to give them up. And Webb named them all himself in his own head, names that had nothing to do with whatever their real names were. Ren, who didn't eat much but who watched Webb constantly with an intensity that made him feel like he was being measured for something. Not assessed for threat. Something else. Ren watched him the way a scientist watches an experiment, and the experiment was him, and whatever hypothesis she was testing, she was tracking it with quiet, patient precision. He fed them protein loaf and reconstituted vegetables for the first 2 days. On the 3rd day he made flat bread, the kind his grandmother had made, cooked on the dry, griddle surface of the warming plate. The smell of it hit the corridor before the service door was open, and he found all 4 of them pressed against the polycarbonate again when he turned around. He gave them the bread warm. Darrow ate 1 piece and then held the 2nd piece for a long time without eating it, and Webb had the feeling she was saving it for someone. He put a 5th portion on the plate without comment. She looked at him. He looked at her. He pointed at the extra portion and made a vague gesture toward the corridor. She made the complicated amber-eye expression again. Then she took the extra portion too. He started making a 5th portion every day after that, then a 6th, then a 7th. The number rose slowly as more kids found the service door, and he let it rise without comment, adjusting his inventory requisitions in ways that would pass muster on a cursory inspection. He wasn't hiding it exactly. He just wasn't announcing it. Osai would have had opinions. By the end of the 1st week, Webb had started bringing a folding table to the transit annex. 2 trips, the table in pieces, then the tray. He'd started sitting with them while they ate, bringing his own food, eating at their pace. He wasn't sure why exactly. It just seemed wrong to watch. When you fed children, you ate with them. That was the basic rule, the one his own mother had operated by when any hungry kid turned up at her kitchen. It occurred to him, around day 6, that he was spending more time thinking about feeding these 11 alien children than he had spent thinking about anything in years. He thought about variety, about what seemed to register as palatable versus what they tolerated, about the temperature preferences he'd started mapping based on observation. He thought about nutrition. He'd pulled 3 xenobiology references off the station's academic database, none of them specifically for this species, but useful for establishing baseline principles. He thought about Kale's counting and whether the order mattered nutritionally or was purely psychological, and whether psychological mattered less than nutritional, and then he thought about it some more and decided it didn't matter less and kept arranging the plate in order. He thought about Fenn's scar. It was a burn scar, he was fairly sure, or something functionally analogous to a burn, covering the outer surface of her left forearm in a pattern that suggested an event rather than an injury. Something fast and consuming. He thought about what a 6-day life pod situation looked like when you started it by surviving the destruction of your ship, and he stopped thinking about the scar after that. He thought about Darrow's vacancy, the replaying he could see in her when she went quiet. He started sitting closer to her during meals, not intrusively, just closer, close enough that if she came back from wherever she went, there was something near. She didn't acknowledge it. After a few days, she started choosing the spot next to him. On the 8th day, Webb found station engineer Priya Nair standing in his kitchen doorway, watching him cut flat bread into pieces. "You know there are 11 of them," Nair said. "I counted," Webb said. "You've been feeding them for a week." 8 days. Nair was quiet for a moment. She was one of the 3 people on Teller 9 that Webb genuinely liked. She had the engineer's habit of looking at everything, rooms, people, situations, as though calculating load-bearing tolerances. She didn't offer opinions unless asked, and when she did offer them, they were usually right. "Osai doesn't know," Nair said. "Osai knows what she wants to know." "There's going to be a jurisdictional problem," Nair said. "The Vethseller was a galactic compact vessel. The kids are technically compact dependents. Somebody's going to come looking for them." "They're not dependents," Webb said. "They're children, there's a difference." Nair looked at the row of portions he was arranging on the tray. "They eat a lot for their size." "Growing." She was quiet again for a moment. Then she said, "The atmospheric sensors have been doing something strange for 3 days. I've been trying to figure out what." Webb looked up. "What kind of strange?" "The radiation signature from the CME that destroyed the Vethseller, it's not dissipating the way it should. The station's hull is absorbing it, slowly. The accumulation is tiny right now. But—" She paused, and her voice shifted into the register she used when she was about to say something she'd been rehearsing because she needed to get it exactly right. "You know how methane behaves at ignition threshold." Webb set down the bread knife. "How far out are we?" "Right now, a long way, but the absorption rate is accelerating. I've been running the numbers for 3 days because I kept thinking I was wrong." She stopped. "I'm not wrong." "Have you told Osai?" Nair made a face. "I tried. She asked me to write it up in a formal report and submit it through the maintenance request queue." "How long?" "At current rate, weeks, maybe 6, maybe 8. But if there's another CME event and the stellar charts are suggesting the source star is still active, still cycling, the absorption rate could jump orders of magnitude." She watched him cutting bread. "Days, maybe less." Webb finished cutting the bread. He arranged the pieces on the tray. He thought about the way Darrow saved an extra portion every morning without ever explaining why, and the way Fenn watched the door, and the way Wren watched him, and the particular quality of patience that came from children who had been in a life pod for 6 days and had learned to wait in the way that only comes from having no other choice. "Who else has access to the sensor data?" he said. "Me and 2 techs. The raw feed goes to Osai's dashboard, but she hasn't looked at it." "You need to get the data off station," Webb said. Nair stared at him. "Through what?" "The CME took out the long-range comms array. We're running on short-range only, line of sight to the nearest relay buoy, and the buoy was damaged in the event. The compressed data packet would take—" "How long?" 6 to 8 hours to transmit at current bandwidth. "Then start it tonight." Nair looked at him for a long time. The load-bearing tolerance calculation was clearly happening behind her eyes. "The maintenance queue," she said quietly, "is very backed up." Webb picked up the tray. "I know, shame about that." He was halfway down the corridor to the transit annex when Osai caught him. He had developed a sixth sense over 17 years for the particular sound of director Osai's footsteps. The clipped, deliberate rhythm of someone who had rehearsed what they were going to say, and he had the tray up and balanced in both hands before she turned the corner, which meant he couldn't be stopped without the tray being obviously in the way. She stopped anyway. "Webb," she looked at the tray. Her expression did the thing it always did when confronted with a situation that had evolved beyond the form she had prepared for it. A slight tightening around the eyes, a compression of the lips that was trying very hard to look authoritative rather than panicked. "I'm going to need you to stop. It's lunch. They have nutritional supplements in the annex." "Those supplements," Webb said carefully, "are rated for compact adult standard physiology. They're not sized for children, they don't account for species dietary variation, and 3 of the 11 kids have been showing early signs of nutritional deficiency since they came aboard. He'd been watching. He'd been looking things up. He had 3 medical references open on his tablet at any given time now, cross-referencing the sparse xenobiological data available on this species with general principles of juvenile alien nutrition. The one with the scar on her arm stopped eating the supplements on day 4. She's been eating nothing for 4 days. Nothing, he said again, quietly, in case the first one had bounced off. Osai's face shifted slightly. Not softened exactly, but recalibrated. He could see her pulling up the category for this situation in the mental filing system she used for everything, and the category was coming up empty. The Galactic Compact, she said, is going to send someone to collect them. We need to maintain strict separation of station personnel and compact dependents to avoid. They're children, Webb said. They are hungry children who survived 6 days in an emergency pod after watching their ship destroyed. Whatever jurisdictional thing happens after this is over is not my department. Right now they're hungry. Webb. Director, he kept his voice level. I'm going to take this tray to those kids. You're welcome to write it up. I'll be in my kitchen when you need to find me. He walked past her. She didn't follow. The transit annex smelled of stale, recycled air, and the faintly metallic tang that came from compact standard emergency materials. Everything in there had been designed for function at the expense of everything else, the way emergency gear always was. 11 children sat or stood in small clusters among the equipment, and they all looked up when Webb pushed the door open. In the earlier days, there had been a slight flinching quality to that look-up. The instinctive bracing of children who'd learned that the opening of a door preceded either something good or something bad, and weren't yet sure which category Webb fell into. By day 8 that flinching was mostly gone. He watched it leave over the course of the week, gradually replaced by something that had a different quality. Not quite trust, not quite relief, something more careful than either, an assessment that kept reaching the same result. He set up the folding table. He laid out the portions in the arrangement he'd figured out through trial and observation over the past days. Darrow's portion on the left, slightly larger. Fenn's near the edge of the table where she liked it, closer to the door. Kale's in the center with the pieces separated by category the way he always seemed to prefer them. Wren's toward the back, smaller, away from the noise. And the extra portions for the ones whose preferences he was still learning. They came to the table in the order they always came, and they ate. He ate with them. Wren came and sat across from him. She watched him eat. She ate too in the careful, observant way she did everything. Today she ate more than usual. He noted that without showing he'd noted it. He'd started keeping a mental ledger, appetite variations by individual, watching for the patterns that meant something. You're getting taller, he said. He said things to them all the time, not because they understood the words but because silence felt wrong. I'm going to need to adjust the table height soon. Wren made a sound. Not language as he understood language, the clicking rhythms that he'd come to recognize as their ambient communication, but directed at him. She met his eyes when she did it. Webb made a sound back. He'd been doing this for a few days, poorly and self-consciously, trying to match the rhythmic structure of what he heard. He was probably mangling it completely. He was doing it anyway. Wren tilted her head slightly, the way she always did when he tried. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that she had been reporting to someone every night. Not in words. In those clicking rhythms, directed at a small device she kept in the seam of her outer garment. A device that looked like a simple fastening, but was a long-range communicator of a type so far in advance of anything Teller 9 could detect that the station's sensors registered it as background noise. She had been saying in the compressed high-density transmission language of the Compact's most privileged communication tier, he feeds us before he eats. He learns our order. He saves portions for the ones who don't come to the window. He looked up our biology. He sits with us. He doesn't watch us eat. He makes sounds back when we speak. He is badly wrong about the phonology, but he tries again every time. And in a syntax below the transmission language in the private register that only certain people could receive. He does this because he thinks it is right to do it, not because he was told to, not because there is benefit to him, because he thinks it is right. This is the important thing. This is what you should know first. She watched him chew. She made the sound again. He made a sound back badly. She made the closest thing to a smile that her facial structure permitted, which was a subtle spreading of the thin-lipped mouth and a slight convexity in the compound eye membranes. Webb didn't know what it meant. He finished his lunch. On day 12, the second CME hit. Webb was in the maintenance corridor beneath the mess hall when the lights went amber. He was there because Nair had come to him that morning with a face that had found a new level of controlled calm below whatever he'd thought was her floor, and she'd said the data transmission had failed. The buoy had taken too much damage. The compressed packet was sitting in a queue with nowhere to go. The sensors in the maintenance corridor were, technically, not in Webb's job description. Neither was the junction box he was now crouched beside with a manual bypass kit Nair had left outside his kitchen door that morning, wrapped in a work order form that said routine maintenance, hot water circuit, mess hall B, and was signed in handwriting Webb had never seen before. The junction was the secondary communication node for the station's emergency broadcast system. The primary node was in the operations center, fully under OSI's authority and firewalled accordingly. The secondary node was older, a maintenance-era installation from the station's original build, and it was on Webb's work order because, technically, the hot water circuit ran adjacent to it, and it had never been taken off the maintenance inventory. He'd found it by accident 3 years ago and never done anything with it because he'd had no reason to. It used a different transmission protocol. Older, much more compressed, the kind of bandwidth that had been standard 40 years ago before the compact relay network made it obsolete. It was slow and lossy and nobody used it anymore. It was also completely independent of the damaged buoy because it broadcast on a different frequency entirely, one that bounced off the station's own hull paneling in a way that the original engineers had built in as a backup to a backup to a backup. The kind of redundancy that made sense when you were designing infrastructure for the void, and you had the humility to know all the ways things could go wrong. The CME alarm was still flashing amber when Webb finished the bypass. He started the transmission. Nair's data packet, compressed to a fraction of its original size with some quality loss that she'd calculated as acceptable, began transmitting at the speed of something from 40 years ago, bouncing off Teller 9's hull in a frequency that nobody had monitored in decades, into the wider network where it would eventually reach someone who had the instruments to receive it and the authority to do something about what it said. Webb had no idea who that someone was. He had no idea if anyone was listening on that frequency at all. He'd done the calculation and reached the end of it. The data was too important not to send, and this was the only way to send it, and that was the full extent of the decision. There was nothing complicated about it. He closed the junction box. He walked back to his kitchen. He made lunch. The second CME had accelerated the absorption rate. Nair came to the kitchen that evening and said, with the controlled calm of someone who has made peace with a number they don't like, that the timeline was now 4 days at most. 2 if there was another event. She stood in the doorway of the kitchen and said it without preamble and waited for Webb to respond. "Did the transmission go?" he asked. "It went." "To who?" "Whoever listens on that frequency," Webb said. "I don't know anymore." "Someone." Nair looked at her hands. "The kids," she said, "if the atmosphere hits ignition threshold." "I know. The annex has emergency shielding. It's not rated for. I know, Priya. She was quiet. Then, the protein stores are good for another 3 weeks. The flatbread ingredients. I know what I've got. She nodded. She didn't say anything else. She left. Webb stayed in the kitchen and did the inventory he already knew by heart, because it gave his hands something to do, and because the motion of his hands helped him think clearly. He counted the protein reserves, the vegetable stock, the flour and dried ingredients for the flat bread. He thought about 4 days. He thought about whether there was a way to reinforce the annex's emergency shielding with materials already on the station, and ran through the options, and reached the limit of what he could do without equipment he didn't have. He thought about the transmission going out into the dark on a 40-year-old frequency, bouncing off the hull of a way station at the edge of monitored space, and whether anyone was positioned to receive it and do something with it before the window closed. He thought about Darrow's vacancy and Kale's counting and Finn's scar. He thought about Wren watching him, the hypothesis she was tracking, the experiment that was apparently him. He made a fresh batch of flat bread for morning and went to sleep. The 3rd week had a different quality than the first 2. By day 10, Webb had stopped thinking of what he was doing as a temporary arrangement. The language had shifted somewhere in his mind, from until someone comes for them to something without a defined endpoint, and he caught himself making that shift and didn't try to correct it. He just kept cooking. Darrow had started watching him while he cooked, not just while he plated. She would appear at the service window and stand there while he worked, the compound amber eyes tracking his movements with the same focused attention Finn gave to doors. Except where Finn's attention was vigilant, Darrow's was absorptive. She was learning something. He wasn't sure what. He started narrating while he worked, what he was doing, why, the logic of temperature and timing, the way you knew when the griddle was ready by the way a drop of water behaved when it hit the surface. He didn't know if she understood any of it. She kept watching. On day 11, she appeared at the service door before he opened it and she held out her hand. He looked at it. He gave her the bread knife, handle first. It was smaller than his kitchen knives. He'd noticed she had trouble with the grip width on the larger ones. She held it the way someone holds an unfamiliar tool experimentally, feeling the balance, and then she looked at the bread on the cutting board and looked at him. He stepped aside. She cut the bread. Not perfectly. The pieces were uneven, the smaller ones on the far end where her reach ran out. But she cut it cleanly, and she arranged the pieces on the plate in the order she'd been observing for 11 days. And when she was done, she looked at him with an expression he had no word for except maybe correct. Yes, he said, exactly. She handed the knife back, handle first. He put the 5th portion on the plate. She took it without looking at him, which he'd come to recognize as a kind of acknowledgement that didn't require the acknowledgement to be stated, and she went back down the corridor. He stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then he washed the cutting board and started on the stew. Kale had stopped counting out loud around day 9. Webb had noticed this the way he'd come to notice all of them, peripherally, not staring, the way you notice things when you're paying attention without drawing attention to the fact that you're paying attention. The counting had been a stress behavior, he'd come to think, something Kale had assembled in the life pod from whatever pieces of routine he could find. And by day 9, the meal itself had enough routine of its own that the counting wasn't necessary anymore. The pieces arrived in the right order. The order was predictable. That was enough. On day 12, after the second CME and before Nair came to the kitchen with her new numbers, Finn had done something Webb hadn't expected. She'd been eating, watching the door with the usual focused attention, and then she'd looked at Webb and made a short, sharp clicking sound that was clearly communicative and clearly directed at him. When he looked at her, she held his gaze for a moment and then deliberately turned her eyes to the door. Not in alarm, not as a warning, just showing him what she saw, sharing the watch. He turned and looked at the door, nothing there. He turned back. She had gone back to her food. He thought about this for a long time afterward, what it meant that she'd done that, whether she decided he was worth including in the thing she'd been doing alone this whole time. He thought she had. He thought that was probably one of the more significant things that had happened in the transit annex, even though nothing visible had changed. He made a mental note to start sitting with his back to the wall. Ren, meanwhile, had started bringing him things. Small things, found objects from the annex's emergency supplies, a length of fastening cord, a flat piece of packing material, once a small reflective panel that had broken off from a storage unit. She put them on the table near his plate while they were eating and didn't make a big thing of it. He handled each one with appropriate attention and put it in his shirt pocket. He had no idea what the correct protocol for this was. He didn't know if she was giving them to him, or showing them to him, or conducting some kind of assessment of how he handled objects of different textures and weights. He treated each one as a gift, because, in the absence of information, he defaulted to the interpretation that assumed the most of the person in front of him. On day 13, he brought her something back. A small piece of station commemorative alloy from the station's 15th anniversary kit, about the size of a coin, embossed with Teller 9's designation on one side and an old Earth star chart on the other. He put it next to her plate when she sat down. She picked it up, she turned it over, she looked at the star chart for a long time. Then she put it in her own garment, in the seam where she kept the communicator device he didn't know about. He ate his lunch. They came on day 14. Not in response to the transmission, not as quickly as that. They had been coming regardless, because the destruction of the Veth cellar had been reported through other channels, and the question of the 11 surviving children had been working its way through compact administrative structure, with the particular momentum of something that had powerful people invested in its outcome for reasons that had nothing to do with the welfare of the children themselves. 2 vessels arrived within 6 hours of each other. One was a compact administrative carrier, gray and angular, bearing the sigil of the Dependency Resettlement Division on its hull in the particular font that meant it was official in the way that could not be argued with through normal channels. Webb saw it on the long-range feed that Nair had quietly rerouted to his kitchen's maintenance terminal 2 days ago, because Nair believed in staying informed and also in Webb staying informed. The other bore no sigil at all, no markings, a ship that existed, by the look of it, at the intersection of enormous resources and aggressive anonymity, the absence of identification that was itself a kind of statement, made by someone with the authority to make it and the infrastructure to support it. They arrived and immediately began arguing. Webb could hear the argument from his kitchen, patched through the operations center audio feed that Nair had also quietly rerouted. Osai was in the middle of it, her voice at the higher register it achieved when she was very certain she was handling something correctly, and that certainty was being eroded in real time. The compact administrative representative wanted the children transferred immediately, citing their status as compact dependents, the regulatory framework of the Dependency Resettlement Division, and 3 separate treaty provisions. She cited them from memory, which suggested she'd been preparing for this particular argument. The unmarked vessel's representative, whose voice was flat and uninflected in a way that suggested translation layering, several languages deep, a voice that had been processed and stripped of identifying characteristics with professional thoroughness, said only that the children were not going anywhere. Osai tried to cite the maintenance request queue. Neither party acknowledged her. The compact representative raised the possibility of escalating to the Compact Enforcement Division, which Webb understood to mean they were threatening to involve armed vessels. The other representative said, in the same uninflected tone, that they were welcome to try. Webb turned the audio feed off. He started making dinner. Vegetable stew tonight, from the last of the proper vegetable stock, because he wanted it to be good, and because he had a feeling about the night ahead. He made the flat bread again, enough for tonight and tomorrow, working on autopilot while the rest of his attention was on the arithmetic of the situation. 4 days to ignition threshold. 2 ships in orbit with opposing objectives. A boarding action threatened. A CME event expected from a still-active source star. 11 children in the transit annex 2 corridors away, eating the dinner he was currently making. He was still working through the arithmetic when Wren appeared at the service window. She didn't wait outside, she knocked. He opened the door. She looked up at him with the compound amber eyes and made the clicking rhythms fast and insistent, not the ambient cadence he was used to, but something urgent, directional. He didn't understand it. He looked at her face and tried. She made it again. She pointed first at the floor beneath them, the maintenance corridor he knew was there, the old junction box he'd used 2 days ago. Then she pointed at herself. Then she made a different sound, layered, that he couldn't follow except that it felt like a question. "I don't know what you're saying," he said. "I'm sorry." She looked at him. She made the sound again, slower. The same 3 components, broken out individually, the way you break out the syllables of a word for someone who's still learning. He thought about Nair, 4 days. 2, if there's another event. He thought about the 2 ships in orbit. He thought about the transmission going out on a 40-year-old frequency to whoever was listening. He pulled his maintenance kit from the shelf. He held it up. Her compound eyes did the convexity thing, not quite a smile, something more urgent than that. He followed her. She took him down 3 levels. Not to the secondary communications node he'd used before, but further, to the lowest level of the maintenance infrastructure, the original construction shafts that hadn't been accessed in years by anything that showed up in the station's logs. Webb had been to this level twice in 17 years, once during a power rerouting survey, and once because he'd followed a water pressure anomaly to its source, and found that the source was very far down. His keycard should not have opened the door at the 3rd sublevel. It opened anyway. He filed that away. In the lowest chamber, at the junction of 4 maintenance shafts, where the station's original builders had clearly thought it was a good place to put things they didn't want found, there was a panel he'd never seen. Behind it, when Wren pulled it open with hands that clearly knew exactly where it was and exactly how it worked, was a communications array that was not part of Teller 9 systems at all. It was compact, very compact. Military compact or something above that. The build quality was several generations ahead of anything in the station's inventory, the kind of manufacturing precision that didn't show up in commercial equipment, that existed in the narrow category of things built by people for whom budget is not a constraint and precision is not optional. It had been here for a while. It was powered from a source he couldn't identify, drawing from something that wasn't on the station's power grid. It had a frequency range he couldn't read from the controls. And it was active. Wren pointed at the array. She pointed at him. She made the clicking sound, slow and deliberate, the one he'd started to associate with something important being said. He sat down in front of the array. He looked at the controls for a long time. They were not made for human hands or human eyes, but they were made with a logic he could follow, because all communication systems followed the same logic underneath the surface, regardless of species. Input, carrier wave, output. There were only so many ways to move information through space. The controls were intuitive in the way that tools made by people who knew exactly what they were doing are always intuitive, once you stopped looking for labels and started looking for function. He found the transmit key. He pressed it. "This is Marcus Webb," he said. "Mess hall supervisor, way station Teller 9. I've got 11 kids down here who have been eating my cooking for 2 weeks, and I'd really like to talk to whoever's in charge of the ship with no markings." Silence. Then a voice. Not the flat, translation-layered voice from the operations center feed. This one was clear, direct, female in register, or at least carrying the harmonics that human ears map to female. It had a quality he didn't have a word for, the quality of a voice that had spent a long time being very careful about what it said and how it said it, and had decided, right now, in this specific moment, to stop being careful. "You've been feeding them," it said. "Every day." "Flat bread," the voice said. "Yesterday, stew tonight. Before that, protein loaf, cut into pieces sized for smaller hands." Webb said nothing. He waited. "Kale eats in a specific order," the voice said. "You learned it." "Third day," Webb said. "It wasn't hard to figure out once I watched." Another silence, longer. "The transmission you sent," the voice said, "on the maintenance frequency, the radiation absorption data. Someone needed to know. It reached us," a pause that had weight in it. "It reached us 12 hours ago. We were already moving, but the data confirmed the timeline. We would have arrived in time, but you didn't know that." "No," Webb said, "I didn't." "You sent it anyway." "I sent it anyway." The silence this time had a different quality. He couldn't characterize how exactly. It was the same absence of sound, but it felt like it was waiting for something different. "The compact vessel in orbit," the voice said, "is going to attempt a boarding action in approximately 4 hours. They have determined that we lack the authorization to resist it under current treaty provisions." A pause. "They are incorrect, but the process of establishing that incorrectness will take longer than 4 hours. "The atmosphere," Webb said. "If there's another CME while the boarding action is happening." "There will be another event," the voice said. "Within 6 hours we have been tracking the source star. Your engineer's data confirmed our own models." A pause. "We need to move the children, now. And we need the boarding action delayed by enough time to do it safely." Webb thought about the 2 ships in orbit. He thought about Osai in the operations center, her certainty being eroded in real time. He thought about the junction box in the maintenance corridor and the 40-year-old frequency, and whoever listened on it. "What frequency does the compact administrative vessel monitor?" he said. A pause. "You're going to try to talk to them." "I'm going to try to make them listen," Webb said. "There's a difference." Another pause, longer. He got the impression the person on the other end of the line was making a decision about him, a fast one, the kind that gets made in the space of a breath when the situation doesn't allow for deliberation. Then a frequency number, a long string of numerals in a system he could translate, roughly, into the array's controls. He found the input. He adjusted the carrier wave. He pressed transmit. "This is Marcus Webb," he said. "Mess hall supervisor, way station teller 9. I'm transmitting radiation absorption data for the station's current atmospheric status on the frequency I'm transmitting from. You'll want to record it." He gave it a second for recording equipment to engage. "Current methane accumulation stands at 3.2% and accelerating. At projected absorption rate, ignition threshold will be crossed within 4 to 6 hours. A coronal event from the source star is expected within that same window based on stellar observation data compiled by Teller 9 station engineer over the past 12 days. He paused. "I have 11 children on this station. I don't know what they are to you in terms of jurisdictional category. I don't know the treaty provisions, and I'm not going to pretend I do. But if your boarding action proceeds during a coronal event with the station at 3.2% methane and rising, you will not recover those children. You will not recover anything. And you will have a hard time explaining that to anyone afterward." He waited. The compact frequency crackled. A voice, different from the flat representative, higher in the command structure by the authority it carried, someone who had been monitoring and had not expected to hear this from this source. "Teller 9 maintenance. Identify your authority for this transmission and your source for the atmospheric data." "My source is our station engineer, Dr. Priya Nair," Webb said. My authority is that I'm the person standing at the only communications array currently operational on this station, and I've got 11 children in the transit annex 2 corridors from my kitchen, and I'd like them to survive the next 6 hours. A pause. Transmit the data packet, the voice said. Webb found the data output in the array's interface, Nair's compressed radiation readings, which he'd uploaded from the maintenance terminal to the array's buffer before coming down here, because he'd had a feeling he might need them. He transmitted them. The compact frequency went quiet. The boarding action was delayed. Not indefinitely, compact administrative machinery didn't work that way, and its momentum, once engaged, required a substantial input of force to change direction. But by 6 hours, while the data was reviewed at levels above the representative in Teller 9's operations center, someone with more authority than her looked at the numbers and decided that 6 hours was a reasonable exchange for not being responsible for 11 children dying in an atmosphere ignition event. 6 hours was enough. Webb went back upstairs. He went to the transit annex. All 11 children were awake, which meant they'd been awake for a while, which meant they had known something was coming, in the way that children who have already survived the worst thing they can imagine develop a sixth sense for the approach of the next worst thing. He didn't try to explain. He finished making dinner, working fast, the stew in a portable unit he'd brought down, the flat bread reheated on the tray, the same arrangements he always made, the same order. They ate. He ate with them. Darrow sat next to him in the spot she'd been choosing for the past week. She ate her portion without the vacancy this time. She was present, watching the door. Fenn was watching, both of them in a mode that Webb recognized without having a name for it, a readiness that wasn't fear, that had gone through fear and come out the other side. 40 minutes later, Nair appeared at the annex door and said quietly, "The unmarked ship is docking." They left in a group. All 11, moving with the purposeful cohesion of children who had spent 6 days in a life pod and knew how to move together when it mattered. Webb walked with them, not in front, not directing, just alongside because it felt wrong to do anything else. Fenn walked on his left, closest to the walls. Darrow walked slightly ahead, setting the pace. Cale counted something quietly. In the docking bay, the airlock from the unmarked vessel opened. The figure that came through it was not what Webb had expected, though afterward he wouldn't have been able to say what he'd expected. She was tall, taller than human standard, with the same pale, ridged skin as the children, the same compound amber eyes, but older. The dappled darker patches were more numerous, more complex in their patterning. The eyes carried a depth that came from seeing things for a long time and not having the option of looking away. She was wearing something that was not quite clothing, not quite armor, something in between, that bore no marking Webb could read, but that carried the particular quality of things made for someone specifically, with no consideration of expense. She walked into the bay and the 11 children moved toward her, not running but fast, the way children move toward someone they've been waiting for without saying they're waiting, and she gathered them. All 11, arms that were long enough to manage it. She held them in the middle of the docking bay and she was very quiet for a long time, and Webb stood at the edge of the bay and waited. After a long time, she looked up at him. He met her eyes. She was the voice from the array. He was certain of it the moment he saw her face. The voice had carried something that her expression confirmed. She was the person who had decided to stop being careful. "Marcus Webb," she said. "That's me. You fed them for 14 days. 12 really. 2 of those I wasn't sure they were coming. They were always going to come." A pause. The translation layering in her voice shifted slightly. Something underneath it adjusted. "You did not know who they were. They were hungry kids. You did not know who their mother was." "No," Webb said, "I didn't." She was quiet for a moment. What she was, what she held, had no clean translation into human political vocabulary. She governed a stellar region containing 400 inhabited systems. She commanded resources on a scale that made waystation budgets a rounding error. She had spent the past 2 weeks moving through space in an unmarked vessel, burning days she couldn't afford in a political sense, to find 11 children that a bureaucratic system had filed as compact dependents pending resettlement review, and she had done it without making it an event, because she had seen what it did to children when their recovery became a political event, and she had decided her children would not have that. She had expected the station to process them. She had not expected them to be fed. She had not expected flat bread. She had not expected the correct arrangement of Kale's plate. She had not expected someone to sit with them while they ate so they wouldn't eat alone. She had not expected a human mess hall supervisor to find a 40-year-old backup frequency and use it to transmit critical atmospheric data to an unknown recipient on the chance that someone was listening, and then to go back upstairs and make lunch. Darrow, she said quietly. Darrow, the eldest, the one who moved with the careful deliberateness of someone recently in charge, came to her and spoke in the clicking rhythms for a long time. She listened. She looked at Webb while she listened, the compound amber eyes reading something in his face that he had no way to read back. She said something to Darrow quietly, and Darrow went back to the group. "Wren," she said, and Wren looked at Webb and then back at her mother, and said something that was short and precise and seemed to settle something. "She says you try to speak our language," the Empress said. "Badly," Webb said. He paused. "I didn't want them eating in silence. It seemed wrong." The Empress looked at him for a long time. "The transmission you sent," she said, "on the maintenance frequency. It reached my communication officer, who brought it to me, who had already calculated the timeline but had been working from our own sensor data without the station's internal absorption readings." She paused. "You gave us 3 hours we did not have before." "Nair figured out the numbers," Webb said. "I just found the frequency." "You found a 40-year-old backup system and used it to transmit critical data to an unknown recipient without knowing if anyone was listening." Someone was listening. There was a significant probability that no one was. "I know," Webb said. "I sent it anyway." She studied him. He had the distinct impression that the compound amber eyes were seeing things he couldn't account for, spectrums he didn't have the equipment to register, layers of information he was simply not built to perceive. He held still and let her look. Then she said something in her own language, unhurried, direct to Fenn, who was standing closest, Fenn with the scar on her arm and the habit of watching doors. Fenn looked at Webb. She looked at him for a long moment with the focused attention she gave to things she was making a decision about. Then she went to him and held out both four-fingered hands, palms up, fingers spread, a gesture that meant nothing to Webb until he looked at it in the context of everything that had led to it, and then it meant everything. He put his hands on hers. She pressed them. Then she went back to the group. OS filed 4 formal complaints about unauthorized use of station communication infrastructure, one about unauthorized food distribution to compact dependents, and one, Webb's favorite, about an improper modification to the hot water circuit adjacent to the secondary communication node in maintenance sublevel B. Webb signed for all of them with the signature of a man who had stopped worrying about formal complaints approximately 14 days ago and was not planning to start again. Nair was quietly offered a position by the Compact Science Division's Advanced Materials Research Team, on the strength of the radiation analysis she'd done on equipment that had no business being as accurate as she'd made it. She declined and stayed on Teller 9, but she asked for the offer in writing and framed it and hung it above her workbench, which Webb felt was the correct response. The compact administrative vessel left first, filing a report that described the situation in language that made it sound like a successful resettlement review conducted in full compliance with applicable treaty provisions, because compact administrative machinery was very good at making situations sound like whatever was most convenient for compact administrative machinery. And also because the alternative was admitting that a mess hall supervisor had temporarily stalled a boarding action on an atmospheric data argument, and they didn't have a form for that. The unmarked vessel left last. Before it did, Darrow came back through the airlock. She walked down the docking bay to where Webb was standing. She had something in her hands, small, flat, the size of a palm, made of a material he couldn't identify. She held it out. He took it. He turned it over. It had a pattern on it that he didn't recognize, in a material that caught light the way the darker patches on birchbark skin caught light. Not a word, not an image exactly. Something in between, the way a smell can carry a whole memory, bypassing language entirely. He looked at her. She pointed at the object. She pointed at him. She made one of the clicking sounds, not the ambient ones, not the urgent directional ones, but a new one, short, clear, a sound he'd never heard any of them make before. He tried to repeat it. She tilted her head slightly. He tried again, adjusting the rhythm. She made the convexity thing with her compound eyes, the spreading of the thin-lipped mouth, the thing he'd decided to interpret as a smile because he didn't have a better word and had stopped thinking he needed one. Then she went back through the airlock. He stood in the empty docking bay with the flat, light-catching object in his hands and listened to the airlock seal. He turned the object over once more. The pattern on it caught the bay lighting differently at each angle, and he thought that the pattern was probably not decorative, that it was probably language, that it was probably something very specific. He didn't know what it said. He kept it. 3 weeks later, a translation package arrived in his maintenance terminal, patched through the same secondary communication node, on the same 40-year-old frequency, which now apparently someone monitored. The package was labeled in compact administrative notation as routine technical documentation, which was how things got through certain filters without questions. It translated into human script only partially, because the concepts involved did not have clean equivalents in any language Webb spoke. The translation matrix was careful to note its own limitations, flagging sections where the approximation was substantial, and the original meaning was carrying more than the translation could hold. But the section it could render, it rendered without qualification. He made food. He sat with us while we ate. He did not watch. He tried to speak. He found the frequency and sent the numbers. He did this because he thought it was right, not because he was told to, not because there was benefit, because it was right. And below that, in a format the translation matrix flagged as a formal compact notation, something recorded into the Galactic governance record, a permanent entry in the official history of events, the kind that was retrievable by anyone with archive access across 400 inhabited systems, a phrase that the translation package rendered with a disclaimer about approximation. He made lunch for the hungry children daily. He never knew who their mother was. He made lunch for them anyway. He sat with them while they ate. He tried to say their names in their language. He found the old frequency in the dark and sent the numbers into the void, not knowing if anyone was listening. He was a cook at a way station at the edge of monitored space, and he did what he thought was right. Below that, in a notation the matrix translated only as official witness entry, a single name that was also a title. The matrix declined to translate it directly. The footnote said, "Approximate human equivalent is Empress, but this is substantially inadequate." The notation was a signature. Webb read it twice. He looked at the flat, light-catching object on the corner of his terminal, the one Darrow had given him, the one with the pattern that was probably language that he still couldn't read. He looked at it for a long time. Then he went to his kitchen. He had lunch to make. The warming drawer wasn't going to turn itself on.